You don't need the. I'm doing this my way.
He a legend, he a legend, he a legend. He a legend, he a legend, he a legend. He a legend. Welcome to the league, to the league, to the league, to the league, to the league of Iron. Welcome to the league, to the league, to the league, to the league, to the league of Iron.
What's up, everybody? It's Pikel with League of Items, and in today's video, we're going to discuss the 10 most important players in the LCS, one from each team, and depending on the team, it will mean different things. That's just kind of how it works. So first up, TSM. First up, we have TSM. And I think that the most important player for the most important player for TSM is going to be Spica. And the reason I think that is because if we take a look at the games from this week, you see questionable drafting, in my opinion, and their team is not built around Spica to play Poppy. You have a top laner in Huni who can play a lot of the top lane matchups from both sides right now, which should be a benefit to TSM and should allow them to create a lot of pressure in the top lane. Spica should be going to that lane, trying to pick up kills if Huni's able to create an advantage in lane, set up tower dives, and things like that. Kaiduo, we don't know much about Kaiduo so far, but he doesn't look bad, to say the least. He plays some champions like Ryze where he'd be able to go top lane. Maybe he's into TF. I don't know a lot about Kaiduo as a player. And then we have Tactical and Shen Yi. So Shen Yi is an aggressive, engaged support player. You should be giving Spica champions that can deal damage and carry the game, because that's really what he's been the most successful at throughout his career. And then also with Tactical, I think specifically in the Xerxe game, he looked very questionable in terms of some of his movements on the map. This happens a lot with players that I watch, where they're willing to put themselves into a risky position because they have their flash, instead of thinking to themselves, I cannot put myself into a risky position because I cannot afford to lose flash, because in the next engagement I will need my flash. But getting back to Spica, I think that in order for TSM to be successful this year, Spica needs to do one of two things, and this also involves the coaching staff. Spica needs to reinforce the idea that they're a carry player and play carry champions, or they need to show that they're good enough at the other style of jungling, more similar to what River does, or what Tarzan does, where it's more about playing positional League of Legends, creating pressure on the map through your positioning, always being in the right area at the right time. And obviously that's a very tough ask. I don't think that we've seen Spica perform exceptionally well at that in the past. He's been more of a carry jungler, and I think that's really just the better style for him. So I would prefer they go into that direction, where they're giving him more draft capital and, just playing around him being your carry. Second most important player, the second important player that we're going to talk about is Xerxe. And I'm just doing in this reverse standings because TSM is 0-2 right now. So for Immortals, some people may think that I was going to go with Revenge. I forgot what drop that was, so I just wanted to click it. Immortals has said that they're building their team around Revenge. It's a very stupid idea. Hopefully they stop that immediately. At least, hopefully they stop that when they can go back into the free agent market, get some new players, and actually build like a younger squad. I don't think that they can really win now with the players that they have on their team, specifically Wild Turtle. I think that Xerxe is a pretty good jungler. He's not like a relic of old League of Legends. He's still a not relatively young player. He's still a young player compared to me, because I'm almost 30 and he's 23. He can definitely play that old style League of Legends where his goal is going to be in the right position on the map, reduce variance, and then allow Power Evil to get into that late game stage where he can play control mages around Baron fights, around Dragon fights, and be more impactful that way instead of trying to carve out advantages in the early game. Xerxe is also a player who can play the gank heavy style, but I really don't see Xerxe being a true carry jungler in the style of Inspired or in the style of Peanut or even like El Yoya. That's just not his play style. That's not his optimal play style for the way that this team is constructed. So in order for Xerxe to help his team, it's going to be playing in a kind of it's kind of a boring style of League of Legends where you want to reduce variance as much as possible. And again, it's going to require the coaches actually putting their team into a position through draft that they can play that way. Because if they go to this like, oh, let's just pick strong champions, and they'll pick strong champions, and then we'll just play a regular game of League of Legends. If that's the way that they're approaching things, then they're going to be a very bad team. I think that they're one of the 3 worst teams in the LCS. Regardless of what the standings are at the end of this year, I think that their future prospects are very low because their infrastructure thought it was a good idea to build around revenge, and I think we all know that is a stupid idea. Next up, Golden Guardians, AblazeOlive. AblazeOlive is a very interesting player. I love his champion pool in general because he can play basically anything, and that's why I think he's the most important player for Golden Guardians. On the first day, we saw him play Victor, and then on day 2, he played Corki. So these are generic champions that it's just like, oh, you can pick Victor into anything, you can pick Corki into anything because it's broken. That kind of mentality is going to cause problems for Golden Guardians if that's how they're drafting, because it's really not that simple. If you take a look at Chinese teams and Korean teams, they're more intentional about the picks and why they're picking it. I disagree with some of the thoughts about Victor. People think that he's just a very strong champion overall, but he's always been a burst mage, and he's always been good at controlling certain parts of the Rift. But if you're in a losing position, which Golden Guardians will be often, you can't really play around that because it's going to require you to have tempo in the early game. So what they've done in the first 2 games, in the first game specifically, they drafted an early game team composition, but they weren't able to utilize their early game advantage well enough, and they just didn't look very good. I think that Licorice is an okay player. Pridestalker, I don't really believe in Pridestalker, but his aggressive jungling style makes it even more important for AblazeOlive to use his flexible champion pool, and AblazeOlive can really act as the glue to marry the top and bot and to help roam with his jungler to create advantages in the early game if that's the playstyle they're going to play. If Pridestalker is going to be an assassin jungle player, which we saw in the first 2 games, that's fine. But it's going to require you to draft differently in the mid lane, and AblazeOlive will allow you to do that. So that's why I think he's the most important player for the team. I don't think that Golden Guardians is going to be very good. But that's where like you have to measure a team in line with what you expect them to be. So if they go out there and they're continuously drafting well with the idea that they're going to help Pridestalker get early game advantages, try to snowball and turn that into a win, then that's a success in itself. Whether or not they get results, at least they have a cohesive draft strategy and are trying to put it into practice. Similar to what FlyQuest has done, or Cloud9. They have a strategy. It has worked, so people are happy about it. If it didn't work, but they still had that strategy and were still going after something new, you can always kind of, give yourself some kind of credit. So that's AblazeOlive. Then we have Luger. So CLG, I don't know if they're already in crisis mode, but they might be. Before the season started, I put a bet on them to make the playoffs and to win the LCS, not because I believe they will, but because the odds were just ridiculous, and I thought that they can definitely sneak into playoffs, and they can definitely there would definitely be a hedging opportunity at some point. The problem is that contracts looks horrible, and I'm willing to throw out the first game because that is a game that was going to be very difficult because of the draft. They must not have anticipated FlyQuest going this kind of style with the support top with Smite. But even in that scenario, some of the decision-making from contracts was very questionable, and he didn't really look like... Obviously, playing from behind is difficult, but even though he was playing from behind, there are ways to mitigate the losses that you incur as a team. CLG was in this match for most of it. It was a tight game. They did have chances to win, but at the end of the day, he just looked lost a lot of the time in the early and mid game. And I understand how difficult it was. But in order for this team to be successful, it's going to come down to, first, Contract's getting his shit together, but also it's going to depend on Luger. And the reason why it's going to depend on Luger is because, like I was saying with the Golden Guardians, you need to have an identity that simplifies drafts. If you go into a draft and you say, every champion is a possible champion for us, Counter Logic Gaming, to pick in this draft, then you're going to have problems. What you should be doing is figuring out what your team is good at, figuring out what you think the other team is likely to play, and then going through draft scenarios that will get you into advantageous positions. This will change if you're blue side or red side. Some people don't really take that into consideration, as in like the fans, but all of those things, you need to have a comprehensive draft plan before you get on stage and then try to put it into action. So if you're a team with Luger, who is supposed to be one of your best players, if not your most talented player, you need to get him onto hyper carry champions and figure out ways to help him win the game, because that's really what they're going to be at their core. The second game specifically was very bad from Contract. I almost appreciate that he's willing to die 8 times in a game, because it means that he is, because potentially that could mean he's out there trying to make plays. And CLG did try to do that a little bit in the second game. It reminds me of like the equivalent of the Shy. Like sometimes the Shy will get absolutely dominated in game, and he's always willing to trade because he thinks he can outplay you, and sometimes his scoreline looks really bad. I wish that was the case with Contract. I don't think he's good enough to play that playstyle. I don't know where CLG is going to go from here, but if they are successful, it's going to come down to Luger being able to play hyper carries and carry them in the late game. I don't know how Contracts fits into that picture. I'd have to spend more time thinking about that. But with that being said, I still think that Luger is the most important player, because that's how this team was designed. That's what I believe their intention is. And we'll move on. Next up, we have Han Sama. And Team Liquid looks pretty good. The fact that they're playing Han Sama instead of Core JJ right now is very intelligent, because Core JJ will be able to come into the team and get everything figured out. He's already playing with the team off stage. But for Hans, it's probably more important to get him reps on stage with his new teammates. I know that they weren't at the studio this weekend, but these are important games for Team Liquid. In their first game against 100 Thieves, they looked fine. They didn't lose because of the draft necessarily. It's a playable draft for Team Liquid. It's just you're playing against 100 Thieves, and you always run the risk of just getting beaten by a team that's just as good as you. It's just basically, I don't think the draft was really the problem. And then the second game against Immortals, they played, as we would expect against Immortals. So my opinion on Team Liquid isn't going to change based on this. The reason why I think that Han Sama is the most important player is because in order for Team Liquid to be successful at international competitions, they're going to have to play around Han Sama. Bjergsen will not be the hard carry player at Worlds if they get there. A lot of that hard carrying in the late game team fights, while it might be set up by players like Bjergsen and Isla, or hopefully Core JJ at that point, Han Sama is going to need to execute at a high level. And one example that wasn't Han Sama playing, but think about the either Tactical or Danny from this weekend. They were both in positions where the game was basically 50-50, and they died, and basically the game was lost. I'm not blaming them for the losses, but that's what you kind of need to avoid. I think that Danny and Tactical have the ability to go to Worlds and be good players. We know that Han Sama can do that. He's done it multiple times. So I'm hopeful that as time goes on, Team Liquid can really build their team identity around playing through Han Sama, proactively getting him a lead in the bot lane, getting things like Rift Herald, bringing it bot lane, breaking bot, or bring Han Sama up to Rift Herald and help and allowing him to break top or something like that. It'll be interesting to see how he develops as a part of this team. But I think that it's clear that Han Sama is the most important, because there is no scenario that, in my mind, there are no scenarios where Bjergsen is the most important player. Because if Bjergsen is the most important player, you're going to go to Worlds and get dominated. I was kind of considering Bwipo, but I think we know what we're going to get from Bwipo. It's a lot easier to play top lane in a new environment than it is to play AD carry. Because if you're too aggressive or too passive, you can really hamstring your own team. Next up, we have Jojo Pyon. So everybody knows that Evil Geniuses are my favorite team right now. I am very hopeful that they're going to be good ultimately on a world's stage. There will be a lot of points during this season where we start to question how good this team can be. Their win over TSM was good but not great. Jojo Pyon played good but not great. Has a very flexible champion pool. My issue is that if Evil Geniuses doesn't help build Jojo Pyon an identity in the mid lane as a specific style of player, where he's either playing TF, Rise, and like control mage champions, if they don't put him into one of the boxes for at least a little while, he's never going to become the best player at a specific style. And that's really where you put a lot of pressure on the other teams, because if you play 5 different styles and you go into a draft where you don't know what kind of style Jojo Pyon's going to be asked to play, then he can get lost in a draft. Whereas if you have a default number of a core set of champions that he will default to, your team can function roughly the same with him on a few different champions. And I know that some people watching this may not think that it's important because, you know, most games of League of Legends are somewhat similar. That's why it's important, because you need Jojo Pyon to be able to deal with the different team compositions that are out there in all those different environments. If C9 is successful throughout the year in the economic style League of Legends, then Jojo Pyon will probably need to adapt and incorporate that into his playstyle, or he'll have to find counters to that. The team will also help him do that, but one of those two things would need to happen. And I think that Jojo Pyon is really the only question mark on the team. We know what we're going to get out of Impact. We know what we're going to get out of Inspired. At least I feel like I know what I'm going to get out of Inspired. Danny's a very good player. Vulcan's a very good player. Jojo Pyon is the only potential limiting factor in my mind, unless we see something completely different come out of one of the players we thought was a known quantity. Next up is Kumo, and I think it's pretty obvious from week 1 that Kumo is the most important player on the team, not because he's out there outplaying everybody, but because he is able to play. Well, everybody is able to play the Smite top. It shows that they have a complete disregard for their own lane in a good way. They don't care about, they are willing to sacrifice for their team. And this, as time goes on, will take on many different shapes. I'm sure that Kumo's champion pool is very diverse. He has played carry champions. He can play weak side. He can play tanks. Anybody can play tanks. Anybody can play Smite top. At least pick Smite top. The difference comes in how are you able to effectively use that in a team environment. It's very interesting to see that they've done this, and I wonder if teams are going to end up banning it out or if they're going to try to play against it, because in a game, in a league like the LCS, where you have a set number of games to get yourself into playoffs, I wonder if teams are willing to give FlyQuest Smite top to try to learn how to beat it, or if they want to get rid of it because they place a higher value on winning the game itself. I think you should probably just ban it out and then hope that it makes them transfer to a regular style of League of Legends where they still have a chance to win. But I think that there is somewhat of a competitive advantage for them in that Smite top. I obviously I think that every top laner in the LCS would be willing to learn how to play it if their team demanded it of them. Kumo has already put that into practice, was already looking for the edge in the top lane by doing that. Well, actually, not looking for the edge in the top lane, looking for the edge for his team on the other parts of the map by giving up top lane. Next up, we have Biofrost. So far, Biofrost has been a pleasant surprise for Dig. He has always had a diverse champion pool. I have no doubt that he can play any champion that becomes meta, or he can play anything that will become meta, but it's those off meta picks that are always going to be more influential for someone like Biofrost. We know he can play Thresh at a very high level, which is going to allow Neo to play hyper carry type champions. They showed that they can play a shoving lane and play for the early game. It was against Immortals, but it's good to see that as well. Biofrost and River will be able to look like a very strong jungle support duo because they both seem to have good map awareness, and they've already shown some synergy in regards to being able to move around the map, set up vision for objectives. It's not super difficult, and every professional team should be able to do it, but there are levels of how successful you can be by doing that type of thing. I think that Biofrost is going to be asked to play engaged champions often as well, because River, while we've seen a couple of Jarvan games out of him, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that almost, not exclusively, but if we saw it consistently, Biofrost is going to have a large impact in how they set up team fights, how they actually execute their team fights with his champion pool, because I think that Fake God specifically, playing things like Gwen, Gangplank, who else did he play? Gragas can kind of help with engage, but that doesn't seem like the quintessential Fake God champion to me. I think of more Gangplank. That's going to be something that Biofrost is going to contribute to by bringing in engage options that allow Dignitas to play aggressive in the early game, but also he can be a part of shot calling and engaging in the late game. So that's basically that. Then we have Fudge. Fudge, in my mind, is very similar to Kumo in the sense that Fudge's job is to be flexible so that the rest of the team can play the style of League of Legends that Cloud9 apparently wants to play, which is a supportive enchanter mid lane playing towards the economy aspect of League of Legends, which I do think that a lot of teams will be able to figure out the economy side of League pretty fast. I'm actually going to start taking a look at it again as well. I know the numbers behind item efficiency. I just need to update my spreadsheet, and then I'll probably make a video on that sometime this week. It's not that there is a hard counter to the item stuff, but you need to understand it in order to formulate your opinions on what Cloud9 is doing, and then you can try to look for counterplay or ways to match it or outscale it. Part of that comes from items, part of that comes from champions and drafting. But that's why I think Fudge is really the most important player of the team. And the style is actually going to allow Fudge to to minimize the impact that his lack of experience in mid lane could potentially cause for his team. So by kind of pivoting away from what the normal mid lane matchups looks like, he gets himself back onto even footing. So then he needs to be able to execute at a high level to convert those advantages. That's a pretty simple one. I think it's pretty obvious. Some people would want to say like Berserker or Winsome, or probably Berserker. But in reality, I think all of those players' lives will be much easier if Fudge can play the game the way that LS wants it to. And then last but not least, we have Closer. And Closer is the most important player in a more traditional sense. He is the first or second best player on his team probably in terms of influence, because FBI, even though we think that he is a very good hard carry 80 carry, you need to have a jungler that can get you into those spots by managing the early and mid game, and then also playing well in the high leverage moments around Barons and Dragons, which he has consistently done. This list really wasn't about Closer. This was about a lot of the other players that we looked at. 100 Thieves, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to pick a player off of that team for a most important player is because they really function nicely as a team overall. I think that some people were a little surprised by them beating Team Liquid, but that was like a very easy betting spot because it's a team that's roughly as good as Team Liquid as an underdog. You always want to bet on that. So that's all I've got for you today, really. I'm still trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. I'm about 890 away, something like that. So if you like this video, like, comment, subscribe, share, etc. If you want to check out the Discord, you can gain access through Patreon, $10 a month. I post betting picks. We talk about DraftKings. We talk about betting. We talk about the LCS, LEC, LCK, LPL. So yeah, that's about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.